All significant movements in man's history can be traced to an event or undesirable circumstance that triggered a rallying cry for change. Most wars can be linked to a specific event that lit the powder keg. New laws and entire cultural shifts begin with a trigger. And a crisis is inevitably a great motivator for change. Hi, I'm Shane Mahoney. In North America, we have seen many such triggers for change. Movements that sprang up out of necessity and that seem to be demanded by their times. When all is said and done, we are left with symbols that represent what started it all, and that will allow us to measure how far we have come. As sportsmen who care about wildlife and the environment, we can certainly identify one of these symbols for change, and one that unmistakably represents why we still have wildlife with us and the opportunity to hunt them. I'm talking about the great North American bison. The plight of the American bison, the icon of the West, is well documented. What has escaped many of us, though, is the fact that this one animal, or more accurately its slaughter, triggered one of the greatest conservation and wildlife recovery movements in the history of mankind. This week, on Boone and Crockett country, we will celebrate this great animal and revisit what we have learned from it about ourselves and about the lands we call home.
Boone and Crockett Country, presented by Leupold, America's Optics Authority.
Above me curves the blue arch. Away on either hand stretches the yellow prairie. And scattered near and far are the dark forms of buffalo. They dot the rolling hills, quietly feeding like tame cattle, or lie at ease on the slopes, chewing their cud and half asleep. When co-founder of the Boone and Crockett Club, George Bird Grinnell, penned these words in 1893, it had been scarcely a decade since the plains bison had been virtually eradicated from the American landscape. 100 years before Grinnell's writing, the thunder of 60 million hooves reverberated across the American continent. It is impossible to overstate the sheer numbers of bison that once ruled a sea of grassland across the interior, creating a living robe of hair, horn, and muscle. Just as difficult to comprehend is how, after over 10,000 years in the making, we as a people could draw down this number to a mere few hundred in the blink of an eye.
The near-complete annihilation of the bison is one of man's darkest hours. It was a fever, unchecked, unregulated, and even encouraged and celebrated. Even when the prairie was nothing but a sea of sun-bleached bones, I'm not sure we really knew what we were doing then or had done. The destruction of this seemingly unlimited resource became a dramatic symbol of the myth of the inexhaustibility of our natural resources.
The seeds of destruction for the buffalo were many, and in combination were devastatingly effective. At the core was manifest destiny, the belief that the expansion of civilization across the American continent was inevitable and justified by any means, including the exploitation of natural resources. This belief placed the bison in the iron sights of progress. The crash began for the bison with a rapid influx of people, horses, and firearms, technologies that invited slaughter, and bison were particularly vulnerable. In order to provide necessities for the 15 million person increase in the U.S. population between 1840 and 1860, soldiers, frontiersmen, and professional shooters turned to the bison. As settlers swarmed the plains, the pace of bison killing increased exponentially, augmented first by horse-drawn wagons and then by the great railway expansion. The slaughter was celebrated. Sharpshooters were revered for their prowess in tallying triumphant numbers, skinners for the speed of their knives, and weapons makers for rifles powerful enough to dispatch 1,500-pound animals with ease and in rapid succession. the super-efficient Sharps buffalo rifle, was developed specifically for bison. In addition to providing food and clothing, the bison stood as an obstacle to the expansion of the American population west, as competition both for open space and the growth of the livestock and farming industries. Significant cattle production would be slow in coming, yet ultimately aided in justifying the taking of the American plains from the bison. The diseases cattle brought with them were equally devastating. Brucellosis, tuberculosis, tick fever, and other maladies rivaled market hunting as the main destroyer of bison. Next was open space for crops. Bison turned the sweet wild grasses of the Great Plains and the Grand Prairies into more bison, not manageable cattle and crops. America's population explosion required domesticated grasses like wheat, barley, rice and millet, and the more docile protein of beef cattle. Bison were not good neighbors to either business, another justification for slaughter. What we will learn from this sordid chapter in our history is that it birthed the conservation movement, a movement ignited by sportsmen. How is it that a group of hunters helped to save the hunted from absolute extinction? History shows hunting as conservation in its purest form.
Boone and Crockett Country is in partnership with the Wild Sheep Foundation, putting and keeping sheep on the mountain, and the Dallas Safari Club, promoting conservation and ethical hunting worldwide.
Prior to the arrival of Europeans on American soil, the American Plains Indian, even after acquiring the horse, had little, if any, impact on the numbers and movement of the bison. However, the Plains Indians' nearly total dependence on the bison aided in the destruction of both. Indigenous tribes, like the bison, stood in the way of the U.S. government's desire to move the nation safely west. Native people took great exception to the newly arriving whites laying claim to their ancestral lands and the natural treasures it harbored. The government's decision to move the native tribes onto reservations was met with great resistance, and the Indian Wars erupted across the frontier. It didn't take long for the military-minded regime in Washington to realize that the enemy's reliance upon a single animal was a weakness that they could exploit, and removing the bison would break the backs of their foes. Consequently, the U.S. military slaughtered thousands of bison to deprive tribes of their nomadic lifestyle and force them onto reservations. With the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad in 1867, the bison herd's historical migration routes were bisected. Now market hunters had a reliable way to get fresh meat and hides back to eastern markets. The most famous of them all, Buffalo Bill Cody, obtained a contract in 1867 to supply the Kansas Pacific Railroad with fresh meat, and in the next 18 months claimed to have killed 4,280 bison. With the arrival of the Iron Horse, the annual bison kill climbed steadily to a crest of nearly 5 million in 1871 and 72. By 1873, only scattered bands remained south of the Platte River in Nebraska, too few to support commercial hunting. In less than 8 years, nearly all of the millions of bison that had roamed the prairies were gone.
Wildlife as the enemy to progress, or take as much as we want? Clearly, we have learned from our mistakes of the past. Or have we? We are taking better care of wildlife today, for sure, but some species still remain in the crosshairs of human progress. It's not a full-out slaughter like the bison, of course, but wildlife is still often collateral damage in our drive for progress. The question is this: is it up to sportsmen again to lead the charge to ensure our wildlife gets a fair shake? Personally, I believe so. I would much rather it be hunters and anglers who lead society in these directions
than extreme protectionist groups who advocate against any and all wildlife use.
Two significant actions began the movement to save the bison. Theodore Roosevelt's formation of the Boone and Crockett Club in 1887 to address the decline of all big game species, and the passing of the Lacey Act of 1900, which banned the interstate commerce of wildlife. The bison stood out as a glowing beacon of the misdeeds of the past, and restoration of the bison shifted into high gear once Roosevelt took office in 1902.
One major benefactor of the strengthening of the conservation movement in the early 1900s was the bison. Although the bison in Yellowstone Park had received full legal protection by 1902, the park's remaining 23 animals represented the only wild, free-ranging animals left in the United States. Soon after Theodore Roosevelt moved into the White House, emphasis shifted from protection of the remaining Yellowstone herd to an active program of restoration.
At the urging of the Boone and Crockett Club and the New York Zoological Society, Roosevelt signed into law a bill that created the Wichita National Forest Reserve in Oklahoma, and the New York Zoological Society donated 15 purebred plains bison as a nucleus breeding stock to populate the 59,000-acre reserve. This success triggered the formation of an organization dedicated to the further recovery of the bison, and on December 8, 1905, the American Bison Society was incorporated.
Theodore Roosevelt and William T. Hornaday, with the blessings of their fellow Boone and Crockett members, founded the American Bison Society in 1905. Its purpose was restoration through land acquisition and reintroduction.
The American Bison Society's first major success came on May 23, 1908, when Congress enacted a bill establishing the 20,000-acre National Bison Range near the Flathead Indian Reservation north of Missoula, Montana. Other reintroductions followed. And while the American Bison Society was hard at work establishing these new herds, the government's focus was on the remaining bison in Yellowstone National Park. In 1902, a fenced buffalo ranch was established within the park and stocked with captured animals from the park and fortified with bison from elsewhere. As the herd prospered, a larger facility was constructed in the Lamar Valley in 1907. By 1915, there were 239 bison in Yellowstone, enough to ensure safety from inbreeding, up from just 46 when the program was initiated. In 1933, a national census conducted by the Bureau of Biological Survey estimated the national bison population in wild herds, zoos, and private collections at 22,000 animals, and the American Bison Society, its objective realized, quietly closed its books. Today, there are 25,000 bison in public herds across the country, and another 16,000 roam Canada's 11 million-acre Wood Buffalo National Park.
Boone and Crockett Country is in partnership with the Pope and Young Club for the good of bow hunting and the Guide Outfitter Association of British Columbia. Wildlife stewardship is our priority.
The destruction of the bison herds taught us the power of the hammer we wield. For the first time, a species of megafauna was very nearly erased forever by the hand of man. Fortunately, in the wake of the bison tragedy, a few enlightened sportsmen realized the damage we were capable of inflicting and organized to halt the destruction and change America's views toward wildlife. This movement spurred the recovery, protection, and future for numerous species, which could have suffered a similar fate.
The truth is, we have recovered almost all of the large mammals and birds that were threatened with extinction in North America. Most are doing quite well. The only one unlikely to ever regain its historical, free-ranging numbers is the bison.
In addition to the 25,000 purebred bison that remain in North America, there are an estimated 250,000 captive buffalo held on private ranches that have been hybridized with cattle and raised as products destined for the market.
Buffalo ranching is not without controversy, especially with the renewed threat of brucellosis transmission from bison to cattle. This threat, plus the fact that we no longer have vast, unbroken habitats for bison to roam, combine to leave the bison as the odd man out in full population recovery. Our society has chosen to keep bison with us, but opinions vary on what to do with them.
For a cattle ranching state like Montana and other western states, even though there has not been a documented case of the transfer of brucellosis from wild bison to domestic cattle, it's a risk ranchers can't afford to take. Losing a state's brucellosis-free status will be devastating to the state's economy and ranching families.
Adding fuel to the brucellosis controversy are the escapee bison that roam outside the confines of Yellowstone Park each year, and the planned reintroductions for more free-roaming bison. In the past, state and federal sharpshooters culled these fugitive animals, but the practice drew harsh public outcry. In 2005, the state of Montana reinstated a public hunt for bison that wander outside park boundaries. This hunt continues to this day, but is not without its protesters. Presently, there is a movement in place to create a free-roaming bison refuge in eastern Montana, where bison and other ungulates could theoretically exist in a natural setting. This plan may look good on paper, but this too is wrapped in controversy. Aside from buying up ranches to connect a large enough expanse of habitat and changing historical cattle grazing lands back into bison lands, many question if the unfenced bison will stay put. And what of this region's rich hunting traditions for deer, elk, and pronghorn? Will public access be shut off in favor of one species over another? All good questions that will play out as we continue to try and do right by the people and wildlife.
Boone and Crockett Country has been brought to you by Loopold, America's Optics Authority, and the Boone and Crockett Club, fair chase and conservation since 1887.
Even though he will never again be the Lord of the Plains, the bison remains to this day the symbol of the American West. If this is true, then the bison is also the symbol of a citizen's responsibility to conserve. I think Theodore Roosevelt would have been proud of this fact.
And now, a closer look with Doug Painter, presented by Loopold, America's Optics Authority.
The opportunity to hunt the iconic bison exists today both in the U.S. and Canada, but is mainly relegated to private ranches and commercial operations. Very few truly free-ranging herds still exist. Under Boone and Crockett guidelines for record book entry, there are only a handful of locations where buffalo can be hunted. These are free-ranging herds managed by state, provincial, or tribal wildlife authorities where a structured hunting season and a tag is issued. In the lower 48 states, these include Custer State Park in South Dakota, adjacent to Yellowstone Park in Wyoming and Montana, and portions of Utah and Arizona. Certain Indian reservations have recognized free-ranging herds managed by tribal authority and biologists, including the Crow Indian Reservation in Montana. There are free-ranging herds in Alaska and Canada, including Alberta, the Yukon Territories, and British Columbia. These free-range situations offer a truly wild and fair chase experience for sportsmen looking to reconnect with hunting of a bygone era. Many opt to hunt with traditional buffalo firearms and archery equipment to enhance the connectivity and the experience.
Sometimes it takes a great disaster, but we can learn from our mistakes. Millions of bison were slaughtered before we conceived our great idea, conservation. As sportsmen, we should be proud, not of the near loss of the bison, but what we did to ensure this would never happen to wildlife again. Make no mistake, the challenges for wildlife and to our way of life are not over.
We know the bison will never be able to range free in mass herds like they used to. We also know what science and common sense say is practical. Others, however, have a different viewpoint on the future of wildlife, questioning such things as should we still graze cattle on public land, divert water to irrigate dry land crops, reinstate alpha predators like wolves and grizzlies, and once reestablished, should we manage them on the landscapes they share with man. The truth is, we as sportsmen should advocate for all wildlife, not just those we hunt. However, those who want bison, wolves, and grizzlies back in their historic ranges must be realistic about the implications and the real need for ongoing management. As Theodore Roosevelt once said, wildlife and their habitats cannot speak, so we must and we will. We must also, however, speak in the context of our times and realize how much has truly changed. I'm Shane Mahoney. Thanks for watching. All significant movements in man's history can be traced to an event or undesirable circumstance that triggered a rallying cry for change. Most wars can be linked to a specific event that lit the powder keg. New laws and entire cultural shifts begin with a trigger, and a crisis is inevitably a great motivator for change. Hi, I'm Shane Mahoney. In North America, we have seen many such triggers for change. Movements that sprang up out of necessity and that seem to be demanded by their times. When all is said and done, we are left with symbols that represent what started it all, and that will allow us to measure how far we have come. As sportsmen who care about wildlife and the environment, we can certainly identify one of these symbols for change, and one that unmistakably represents why we still have wildlife with us and the opportunity to hunt them. I'm talking about the great North American bison.
The near complete annihilation of the bison is one of man's darkest hours. It was a fever, unchecked, unregulated, and even encouraged and celebrated.
Wildlife as the enemy to progress, or take as much as we want. Clearly, we have learned from our mistakes of the past, or have we? We are taking better care of wildlife today for sure, but some species still remain in the crosshairs of human progress. It's not a full-out slaughter like the bison, of course, but wildlife is still often collateral damage in our drive for progress. The question is this: is it up to sportsmen again to lead the charge to ensure our wildlife gets a fair shake? The truth is, we have recovered almost all of the large mammals and birds that were threatened with extinction in North America. Most are doing quite well. The only one unlikely to ever regain its historical free-ranging numbers is the bison.
If this is true, then the bison is also the symbol of a citizen's responsibility to conserve. I think Theodore Roosevelt would have been proud of this fact.
Sometimes it takes a great disaster, but we can learn from our mistakes. Millions of bison were slaughtered before we conceived our great idea, conservation. As sportsmen, we should be proud, not of the near loss of the bison, but what we did to ensure this would never happen to wildlife again.